right, Josh, let's trauma bond right now.
Here we go.
You ready? You ready to
Here
trauma
we go.
bond?
What are we going to trauma bond about,
It's
Ben?
kind of funny because I think in some ways, me and Dana kind of grew up within fundamentalist Christianity.
Yes.
And so a lot of times, sometimes things we talk about are
do.
a little bit of a trauma
We
bond.
do,
Like, oh yeah, do you
kinda.
remember that legalism that we had to walk through?
A little bit.
Yeah, so we're not going to trauma bond on this episode, but what we are going to do is kind of define trauma in a very in a way that helps you understand. Again, I think we introduced the idea.
Yeah.
We gave a lot of concepts, but I want to kind of dig down deep and really define what it is, what it isn't.
Yeah.
And to help people identify, what levels of trauma they've experienced. Okay.
No, I think this is so incredibly helpful because since there are so many Christians that are a little bit like, I don't know what I think about some of the like sciences and psychology and stuff like that, or maybe they think psychology is mainly like just like Freud still or something like that, right? To have a pastor who's actually gone and gotten a counseling degree and can kind of explain like you can kind of do the wheat and the chaff thing for people who are more skeptical. Yeah. I think this is fantastic.
Yeah. And what I'm hoping that you'll do is really research this out for yourself. There's so much stuff out there. And again, I think what's really hard is to find good quality Christian resources that talk about trauma, because there are some that really want to dismiss it like, oh, it's just kind of made up. It's this made up term. And you're like, and again, this is not the time for this episode, but I'm going to show you from the Word of God that the idea of trauma is ingrained in the Bible. Yeah. Okay, you're going to see they might not use the word trauma, but the language they use to describe how they think, how they feel, what they're going through sounds like someone who's suffering from some kind of trauma effects. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to give you a definition of trauma.
I'm ready,
Josh, and I got this from the National Institute of Health. So whether or not you agree with them or don't agree with them, I really like this definition. There's a lot of different definitions of trauma out there, but I think this is probably the most robust because I think it covers a lot of key things. And I'll tell you why I like this. Okay, so this is how they define trauma. Trauma is a one-time event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by the individual as physical or emotional, harmful or threatening, and that has a lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being.
Yeah.
That's a lot right there.
That seems solid, though.
So I'm going to read that again, okay? Because I think, here's the thing. It's either a one-time event or a series of events.
Or a set of circumstances.
So the whole idea is trauma can be a one-time thing or can be a series of things that have happened to you. Okay, that is experienced by an individual as either physically or emotionally harmful or threatening. So the idea is whether it is abuse, sexual assault, near-death experience, those are all physical and emotional in ways, or emotion, like the idea of being emotionally manipulated, or like there's a lot of things that can happen to someone just purely emotionally. Not physical at all.
There are kids that go through massive abuse and never have a hand laid on them.
Yes.
But they are massively, massively affected for the rest of their lives.
Yeah. So physical or emotional, harmful or threatening, that has a lasting, and this is the key, lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning. Okay. So that means that what they have gone through has impacted the way they think, feel, operate, like it has fundamentally changed the way they operate in life.
Yeah.
Okay. And it affects them physically, socially, emotionally, and their spiritual well-being. So there's this whole idea that something has happened to me and it has impacted the way I've lived my life in a way that has fundamentally changed. Okay. That is what trauma is. So what traditionally trauma was studied, especially when it was first kind of on the scene psychologically, was this idea of the near-death experience, or something that was threatening to my physical well-being. And so the two most popular things that were studied previously were, again, wartime, something that was happening with war, sexual assaults. Those are really well-studied, well-documented. Trauma, PTSD, all that kind of stuff. We knew that was trauma, they would call those what now the scientific community calls capital T trauma. Okay.
Yeah.
Now what we're saying the last, I would say 6 to maybe even 8 years, but it really the last 4 years has been really prominent in a lot of writing and research is what they call little T trauma. Now, not everyone calls it big T trauma, little T trauma. Some people might say level 1, level 2, level 3. Like they kind of put levels on the traumatic experience. But the whole idea is we know that there are traumatic things that happen to you that are life-threatening.
Yeah.
Okay. And then there are things that happen to you that are traumatic, but not in a life-threatening way, but in a way of safety, well-being, and like I'll share this with you. When I was in 5th grade, my dad moved our family from Virginia to Pennsylvania, and again, that was hard because I was 10 years old. 10 years when you're 10, that is a really rough time to move.
Yeah, your friends.
Okay.
Yeah.
And 5th grade is a hard time to move because 5th graders are just mean.
Yeah.
5th and 6th graders are mean.
Yeah, they are.
And I remember my dad's job he went to work for this Bible college, and it required him to travel around a lot of Sundays, a lot of weekends, and visit different churches and preach to represent the college that he was recruiting for. So that meant me and my brother and sister and my little baby brother and my mom, we would all hop into the Ford LTD station wagon and drive down the road. And there were a lot of times I would go into that new Sunday school classroom, and this is Ben Rudolph, and I would hear the snickers from my last name. Like, Rudolph.
Okay, got
Rudolph
it.
the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And again, I love my last name. Like, I genuinely do.
Yeah,
it's a fun last name.
But it was a thing when
in
you were a
5th
kid.
grade, I hated my last name.
Sure.
And so after a few times of being laughed at in new environments, I remember being in this place like, I don't want to go into anywhere new anymore.
Yeah, of course.
That was hard. That was really hard for me. Like, I didn't want to go with my dad. I wanted to, I'm like, can I just sit with you in your adult Sunday school classroom? Like, I just didn't want to I didn't want to risk they're going to laugh at me because of my last name.
Right.
And again, that's a small T trauma, but it affected me. It had a effect on my willingness to be open and vulnerable to try new things.
Yeah.
Right?
You were a 5th grader. You didn't have like a fully developed prefrontal cortex.
Yeah, I couldn't comprehend these things.
Yeah, this was very big to you at the time.
So the whole idea is all of us have gone through here's what the statistics say. 60% of men and 51% of women have gone through something considered a big T trauma experience. Okay?
Those statistics seem small to me. Are they? I wonder if that's even underreported.
This is from what studies have shown.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
But I would probably consider 95% of us have gone through small T traumas at multiple levels of our life.
At least. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the whole idea is you may not say, well, you're hearing us talk about trauma. And you're like, well, my life's never been threatened. I've never experienced any kind of assault or abuse.
Right.
But it's the idea of, maybe there's a rejection. Your father, you came home one day and all of a sudden your dad was packing up his bags and he's leaving. That's traumatic. Okay.
Yeah.
Idea of rejection, abandonment, humiliation, the sense of feeling trapped or powerless. If you've ever had those kinds of feelings, it's like, again, going back to the analogy that I used last episode, you have this experience and you have no file cabinet for this. You don't know how to process the abandonment. You don't know how to process the feeling of powerlessness, especially when you're younger and you're like, I don't know, like even how to describe what I feel right now.
Yeah.
And many times those kinds of, whether again, we call them adverse childhood experiences, whether those, the typical child has about 8 ACEs. Again, that's what studies.
The average
has 8 adverse childhood experiences, and there's probably more or less depending on how good your parents were or
but
whatever.
The average is 8.
Average is about 8. That's what the most recent study I saw said. So the idea of having these adverse childhood experiences or having these little T events, all of us have been affected in some way with that. Now, here's the thing, okay? here's another interesting. So if I said 60% of men have experienced some kind of big T trauma, 51% of women have a higher propensity for PTSD than men do.
Why do you think that is?
So that's an interesting question. Well, why are men able to process trauma in a more resilient way than females are?
Are they, or are they stuffing it? Are men stuffing it?
Well, again, because they're measuring symptoms of PTSD.
Yeah.
It could be underreporting. Could be like, hey, this is just Dad's just angry every single when it gets.
He doesn't even know why. He's just mad all the time.
But there's this idea of resilience that people that go through traumatic events yet don't suffer from PTSD or don't have the lingering effects of trauma, okay? There's this sense of resilience that they have. So the idea is, again, I brought this idea, not everyone who goes to war walks out with PTSD, okay? Now, they might always, look over their shoulder on in certain environments. They might have, when they first come back, have some loud noise, but they've kind of grown from that. There is a I was reading a story, or I can't remember what book I was reading, but it was about a woman was sharing her experiences, how after her sexual assault, she was very it was traumatic for her, and it changed the way she behaved. She no longer went out at night. Anytime she walks somewhere, she want to go someone with her, and she remembers going back and she got some therapy, and then she remembers like. Now she's able, I go out on my own, I go out at night by myself, I don't care if I walk by myself because I got the help and I got the healing that I needed. And you're like, oh, like, good for her. Like she was able to kind of work through those emotions. And so work through that experience in a way that she's now able to, as much as that traumatic assault affected her well-being and her personhood, she's able now to not allow that to keep her in a cage, a box, or whatever it is, right? Yeah. She's been able to overcome the traumatic event. One of the things that was really interesting when people were studying PTSD, and this was true for women. When the study I read, I can't remember if this was just true for women or men and women. But one of the things that they said was for women that were going through a traumatic event, the women that they talked to, so like 100% of these women had a traumatic event happen to them. Mm-hmm. The ones one of the major differences between the people that had PTSD were lingering effects of this traumatic experience was they saw their traumatic event as a part of their identity. Whereas the people that were able to kind of overcome those traumatic events and overcome what had happened to them viewed it not as who they were, but as something that did happen to them.
Yes.
This is something that happened to me. It's about who I am, though.
Yeah.
So the person that goes through trauma and all of a sudden builds their life around this trauma, it affects them for long. There's just some lingering effects to that. Okay. So one of the things that there's a couple studies that were done that there are both internal and external influences that help people to be resolute against traumatic experiences. Okay, I'm going to give you a list right now of what they say. If someone is healthy in these areas, both internally and externally, you have a greater chance of not falling into trauma. So for example, before I even get into it, there's a great story I love to share. It's from a book that I read. I think I've shared this book on this episode before, or on this podcast before, but it's called Crazy Like Us. The guy wrote this book probably close to back in 2010 or 11. And this guy was it's a story of how we as Americans export our mental health diseases across the world.
Okay. How so?
So the whole idea is Hong Kong, he used every chapter is another unique experience. For example, Hong Kong had like out of a city of how many millions of people, 15 million, 20 million people. I mean, Hong Kong's huge. Right. They had an average of between 5 and 10 cases of anorexia a year. Okay.
Only 5 or 10?
5 to 10 out of the entire population. The moment that American journalists introduced the idea of anorexia to the populace, it exploded by the thousands.
So that's okay. So then in my head, I know this is the annoying question guy, but then in my head, could that be partially like the thing that happened with autism, where people had no idea what?
No,
autism
because that was one of the guy that studied is like, no, this was not.
Yeah. So help me understand.
Yeah, because that's always the case. Is like, oh, is it just because people were reporting it? No. This was a fundamental shift.
A behavioral change.
This
happened.
is a behavioral change.
Interesting.
That happened. Okay.
Interesting.
Because the whole idea was they're introducing this idea of, a mental health disorder to express feelings of pain.
Yeah.
Okay. And they use this basically, and it's very susceptible for young women between the ages of 11 and 18 or something like that.
Right.
Same thing happened with hysteria. Back in the late Victorian age of 1800s, do you hear of hysteria happening today? No, but if you go with DSM, like hysteria is a thing you read about, and it was this, legs going numb. It was this kind of psychological disorder that was always attacking these upper middle class females in England. And the whole idea was there's always something to when, especially young women who have emotional wounds that they've experienced in life, and they don't know how to express it or talk about it, or they feel trapped and they don't know how to get out of it, they will attach themselves to a mental health disorder that helps them to know, like, okay, this is how I feel, right? So that's not the main thing I want to talk about. But one of the chapters in this book was a book on, remember the huge tsunami that happened like 2005 in Southeast Asia? Do you remember when that happened? It was just like devastating.
Horrific.
And there were some psychologist that was vacationing there at the time, and she survived. And she, like, instantly after the tsunami, she's like, oh my gosh, these people are going to be suffering from trauma like massively. Villages wiped out, families separated, and so she just like mobilizes all these Americans to help with it. And what she found is like all this study, all this energy and money and resources and in groups of people, like, tell me, and they realized most of these people didn't have trauma. Most of the native people in those lands did not have what they would consider PTSD from that massive natural.
Because their lives were already that hard? Like that wasn't like it was a blip to them?
Okay,
or like,
so
why?
that's the question. Why?
Yeah.
Why is it that, I'm not saying that no one had PTSD,
right?
But I'm talking like 95% of the people didn't have PTSD from that event.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to give you a list of things that they can say. If you are healthy in these areas, you have the resilience to get through traumatic events and not have the lingering
or at least more likely to.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So the internal resilience means you have a high value of self-esteem. Like you see yourself as competent and valuable, and you don't have low self-esteem. So that is high self-esteem, a high view of yourself. Okay. Not proud, arrogant, but you're confident. You have a sense of confidence. Number 2, trust. You trust in people. There's a higher level of trusting in the goodness of people. All right. That the third one was optimism. You're generally bent towards optimism, so that when something bad happens to you, you're able to redirect it or see it as not the norm, but something that, okay, I understand this, but hey, life is good and I'm going to make the best of it. Okay.
Yeah.
Another one is a sense of humor.
Oh, that's interesting.
People that could somehow laugh at their traumatic experience.
Yeah.
Were able to process it better.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Another one was secure attachments. They and I don't have the time to get into attachment styles, attachment orders, and things like that. But the idea is you have secure attachment in your relationships. You feel safe and secure within your primary caregiver relationships with parents or spouses or children. And you feel like I can be open, vulnerable, and I'm accepted, and I can share my heart, and they accept me for who I am.
Yeah.
Okay. And the last one is they have strong problem-solving skills. So if someone's able to, as a kind of a problem solver, is able to say, okay, this is a really bad thing, but I'm going to figure out how to get through this.
Right.
Those are the internal. If you had couple of those internal qualities, your ability to walk through the traumatic event and not let it affect you for long term was much higher.
Yeah.
Okay. Those are internal factors. The external factors were you felt safe. Like there's a sense of safety that you have, even though there was a sense of this is really bad. I almost died here. But generally, in every other area of your life, you feel safe.
You got to have your Maslow's hierarchy of needs in order, right?
100%. If those hierarchy needs are taken care of, you're going to have less PTSD.
Yeah.
Another one, this is interesting, religious affiliation.
Interesting.
People who had a religious affiliation to their life were less likely to experience PTSD.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Which makes sense.
Yeah.
Because someone who believes in a God who is sovereign and in control and gives us perspective, and we're going to get into that next episode. But the whole idea is there is a sense of, it'll
work out in the end.
It will work out. God's going to turn all things together for good.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Romans 8:28.
Yeah. So that's religious affiliation. Third one, they had strong role models. They had people in their life that they could look to that could say, this is someone I can love, trust, who's going to help me to get through this.
Yeah.
Right? And the last one is a sense of belonging or companionship in their life. That they had a community that was strong, that they could rest into, hey, be vulnerable and say, hey, I'm struggling here and I need your help. And so those are the external factors that could help someone through these kinds of things. If you didn't have those external factors or those internal factors, that's why I talk about those two different people. You know, one guy goes through war, the other guy goes through the same war.
Yeah. One
guy just falls apart, right? And again, I'm not saying there's something wrong with this guy. I'm just saying there are, whether it's environmental, whether it's the family they grow up in, whether it's just predisposition, there's a stronger likelihood of someone experiencing trauma or the effects of trauma if they had those kinds of personality.
Because it's like you've got two different inputs going in, not the same input. And so it makes sense that you might have two different outputs coming out because there's so much effect that can happen. So to tie a bow before we end this episode, so the tsunami in Southeast Asia, where a lot of people seem to be less like long-term traumatized. Is it because they had a bunch of these things?
Yes, they had community.
It's community.
There was a sense of these tribal communities were able to these two children, they lost their parents, but they had this aunt and uncle or other, like people just sweep them up and be part of their family. And it was just like, maybe it's because of they're used to tsunamis every so often. They kind of know how to handle it. It's kind of like if you grow up in Kansas, you just know, hey, twisters, there's going to be some tornadoes, and we kind of walk through them. Whereas for you and I, who maybe have never lived through a tornado, be like, we're freaking out, right? So this idea of there's this cultural expectation of we know what to expect. It doesn't mean that's not hard. It just means the community that was surrounding them, they're able to provide the support that where they're not alone. They don't feel like, I can't talk about it.
Yeah.
There's no one there for me. They had a much stronger sense of community that we don't typically have in America.
So it sounds like the takeaway from that story is not that, all these people, they didn't have big trauma, they had little t trauma, but instead that community and the other things on those lists that you gave us are incredibly important. It can make a huge difference between, how quickly and how well we heal from both big T and little t trauma.
Yes, 100%.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So, I mean, like you think about this, I know we're running over, but you have two 13-year-old kids. Okay. They're two 13-year-old girls that go to school. Both of them are getting bullied.
Yeah.
Okay. One of them is a part of a family where, there's no support, there's no connection. Mom and dad are absent or just completely ignorant of what they don't have a family system by which they're engaged, they're attuned. They're like, hey, how was school today? What's going on? And if they bring problems with what's going, they get angry. So they're going to have a much harder time dealing with that small t trauma than the 13-year-old that is experiencing bullying. They come home and she feels open to say, Mom and Dad, this is what's going on. And Mom and Dad are attuned and they care and they talk about it and say, okay, let's solve this. How do we fix this thing? And whether they feel supported, they feel loved, like both those people that go through the same exact experience will have vastly different processing skills and outcomes because of their community around them.
Wow.
So it's so important.
Really interesting.
Going back to the Word of God, when God says it is not good for man to be alone. I mean, just right there, there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
So anyways,
Wow.
hey, I hope this has been another educational, informative, learning about trauma. I hope that you are evaluating. Maybe you're sitting there saying, man, I've got some little T traumas, some big T traumas. What do I do with these traumas? Well, next episode, we're going to be talking about, okay, how does the Bible help us? Because, okay, so now we're going to engage with all the things that we know what trauma is to the Word of God, and how does that begin the healing journey that I need to be going on? Because the last thing I know for Josh, you and I, we don't want trauma to be this lingering effect in our lives that hinders us from enjoying the fullness of life.
No.
So, and I think that's the thing that one of the reasons why we're doing this, I want to make sure that you are, if you're feeling stuck in your trauma, there is a solution for that. Don't feel stuck. I want you to find the way that God wants you to have find healing. So, thank you again for joining us on this episode of Life Talks. We'll talk to you next time.